Tonight, you will gently fall asleep to the miracles of Jesus. Tuck yourself in, make yourself comfortable, and let every worry fade away. As the words flow into your heart, may the miracles of Jesus bring you peace, comfort, and rest, surrounding you with love as you drift into a deep and restful sleep. We will start with turning water into wine. In the rolling hills of Galilee, there was a small village named Cana. Life there was simple, yet deeply rooted in tradition. The people of Cana were close-knit, bound together by their faith, their families, and their celebrations. Among the most joyful events in a Jewish village was a wedding feast. Weddings in those days were not short occasions that ended in a matter of hours, as many do today. Instead, they were community events lasting 7 full days. Friends, family, and neighbors would all gather, bringing laughter, music, dancing, and, of course, food and wine. Wine, in particular, was a vital part of such a celebration. It was not just a drink, it was a symbol of joy, blessing, and abundance. To run out of wine at a wedding was more than just a minor inconvenience, it was a source of shame and embarrassment for the hosts. In a culture where honor was highly valued, such a failure would be remembered for years. It was into this setting, into the midst of one such wedding in Cana, that Jesus, his mother Mary, and his disciples were invited. Jesus had only recently begun his public ministry, and his disciples were still getting to know him, still watching and wondering what kind of leader he would be. For them, this wedding would become an unforgettable moment, the very first sign that revealed his glory. The feast went on with joy and gladness. The tables were spread, the music played, and guests laughed together under the soft Galilean sky. Yet behind the scenes, a quiet crisis was brewing. The servants whispered among themselves, and their anxious glances betrayed the problem: the wine had run out. Mary, the mother of Jesus, somehow became aware of the situation. Perhaps she overheard the worried voices of the servants. Perhaps she noticed the concern in the eyes of the bridegroom's family. Either way, Mary recognized the weight of the problem. She knew the humiliation that could fall upon this family if their guests discovered there was no more wine to drink. And so, with faith that had been nurtured for decades, she turned to her son. "They have no more wine," she told him. It was a simple statement, but one filled with both urgency and quiet trust. Mary did not instruct Jesus what to do, she merely presented the need. She had carried him in her womb, raised him in her home, and treasured the mysteries that surrounded his birth and life. She knew, even if she did not fully understand how, that he was able to provide. Jesus replied in a way that may sound distant to our ears: "Woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come." This was not a harsh rebuke. In that culture, the term woman was a respectful address, much like madam might be today. Yet his words carried deeper meaning. Jesus was reminding Mary, and all who would later hear this story, that his mission was not driven by human agendas, but by divine timing. His miracles, his signs, his works of power would unfold according to the will of his Father in heaven. Yet Mary was not shaken. With quiet faith, she turned to the servants and said, "Do whatever he tells you." In those words, Mary revealed the posture of true discipleship: to trust Jesus completely, to obey him without hesitation, even when the outcome is unknown. Nearby stood 6 large stone water jars, each used for the Jewish rites of purification. They were enormous, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus looked at the servants and gave his command: "Fill the jars with water." The servants obeyed. They filled the jars to the brim, likely carrying bucket after bucket of water until the vessels overflowed. What a strange command this must have seemed. Water in purification jars was not what the guests needed. They needed wine for the feast. Yet the servants did not question, nor did they argue. They simply did as Jesus said. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." Somewhere between the moment they filled the jars and the moment they drew from them, the water had become wine. Not cheap wine, not watered-down wine, but the richest, most exquisite wine the feast had ever known. The master of the banquet tasted it and was astonished. he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink, but you have saved the best till now." In that moment, a quiet miracle had unfolded, one not shouted from rooftops or performed before crowds in the marketplace, but a sign given in the intimacy of a wedding celebration. Jesus' disciples, watching this unfold, saw more than just the transformation of water into wine. They saw his glory. And they believed in him. This was the beginning of signs, the first public miracle of Jesus. It was not done in the temple, not before rulers or religious leaders, but at a humble village wedding. It was an act of compassion, preserving the joy and honor of a family and blessing all who were present. The story of water turned into wine holds layers of meaning that speak to us even today. First, it shows us the compassion of Jesus. He cared about the needs of ordinary people, even in something as simple as a wedding feast. No concern is too small for him. If he could provide wine for a family in Cana, he can provide for us in our daily lives. Second, it reveals his power over creation. To change water into wine in an instant is to display authority over nature itself. This miracle whispers of the Creator's hand, reminding us that the one who made the heavens and the earth stood among them in human flesh. Third, it points to the abundance of his grace. The jars were filled to the brim, and the wine was of the highest quality. When Jesus gives, he gives abundantly and generously. His blessings are not half measures, they overflow. Finally, it foreshadows the greater work he would accomplish. Wine, in Scripture, often symbolizes joy, covenant, and even his own blood poured out for us. In this first miracle, we catch a glimpse of the ultimate transformation he would bring, turning sorrow into joy, death into life, sinners into saints, through the sacrifice of his own life. As you reflect on this first miracle of Jesus, let your heart rest in the truth that he is present in both the grand moments of life and the quiet, ordinary ones. He notices your needs, he cares about your burdens, and he is able to transform them into blessings far beyond what you could imagine. Think of the servants who filled the jars with water. They did something simple, ordinary, almost mundane. Yet because they obeyed Jesus, they witnessed a miracle. Perhaps in your life, too, it is in simple obedience, in daily acts of trust, in faithfulness to his word, that you will see his glory revealed. And as the disciples believed in him that day in Cana, may your faith also be strengthened. For the same Jesus who turned water into wine is with you still, abundant in mercy, rich in love, and faithful to provide. And so, from the joy of a wedding feast in Cana, we now move to another scene. This time, not laughter and dancing, but fear and trembling on the open sea. Let us turn to the next miracle, where Jesus calms the storm. Calming the storm. The Sea of Galilee is a place of both beauty and unpredictability. Nestled among hills and valleys, its waters could be calm and glass-like one moment, and then, with little warning, whipped into violent waves by sudden winds rushing down from the surrounding cliffs. To the fishermen who lived along its shores, the sea was both friend and foe, a source of livelihood, but also a place of danger. On one particular day, after hours of teaching by the water's edge, Jesus found himself surrounded by great crowds. They pressed close to hear his words, so much so that he stepped into a boat, sitting down while the people stood along the shore. From there, he taught them in parables, stories about seeds and soil, about lamps and baskets, about the kingdom of God breaking into the world like a mystery being revealed. By the time evening came, the sky dimmed, and the light softened over the waters. Jesus, weary from a day of ministry, turned to his disciples with a simple request, "Let us go over to the other side." They left the crowd behind, took him along in the boat just as he was, and set out across the sea. Other boats followed, their sails catching the evening breeze, their crews settling in for what seemed like an ordinary crossing. But what awaited them would be no ordinary night. As the boat moved farther from shore, the calm of twilight gave way to something far more menacing. Dark clouds rolled across the sky. A wind began to rise, gentle at first, then fierce and unrelenting. The Sea of Galilee, shallow and surrounded by steep terrain, was known for such sudden squalls. Soon the boat began to pitch and roll as waves slapped against its sides. Water spilled over the edges, soaking the disciples as they struggled to steady themselves. The wind howled, filling the air with its roar, while the sea churned violently beneath them. Some of the disciples were seasoned fishermen. They had spent their lives on this very lake, braving its moods. But this storm was no ordinary storm. Its fury was greater than they could manage. Even they, the strongest among them, began to fear. The smaller boats that had followed could barely be seen through sheets of rain and spray. The disciples bailed water frantically, their hands raw and slippery. The boat groaned and creaked under the strain. Each new wave seemed ready to capsize them. Panic gripped their hearts. Death felt near. And where was Jesus? There, at the back of the boat, he lay asleep on a cushion. The disciples could scarcely believe it. How could he sleep at such a time? The storm raged, their lives hung in the balance, and yet their teacher, their master, rested in untroubled peace. Perhaps some tried longer than others to endure without waking him, but eventually, desperation overcame restraint. They shook him awake, crying out above the storm, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" It was more than a question. It was the cry of terrified hearts, the cry of people who had reached the end of themselves. They did not doubt his power entirely. After all, they had seen him heal the sick and cast out demons. But in this moment, fear overshadowed faith. They questioned his care, his presence, his concern for them in their hour of need. And perhaps, in their words, we hear echoes of our own cries in times of trial. "Lord, don't you see what I'm going through? Don't you care that I'm overwhelmed, that I'm sinking, that the storm is more than I can bear?" Jesus rose to his feet, the wind lashing against him, rain soaking his garments. He faced the chaos of the storm, and with a voice that carried both authority and calm, he rebuked the wind and spoke to the waves. "Peace! Be still!" And just as suddenly as it had risen, the storm obeyed. The wind ceased. The waves grew quiet. The sea, once raging with violence, lay smooth as glass under the night sky. The silence that followed was as profound as the storm had been terrifying. Not even the faintest ripple disturbed the calm. The disciples stood in awe, their hearts pounding, but now from wonder rather than fear. Never before had they seen such a thing. Nature itself had submitted to his command. Jesus then turned to his disciples and asked, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" His words were not meant to shame them but to teach them. The storm had revealed the depth of their fear and the smallness of their trust. They had seen his power, they had walked with him, yet in the moment of crisis, their faith faltered. Still, this was part of their journey, and part of ours. Faith is not perfected in an instant. It grows, often through trials, often through storms. The disciples' fear would one day give way to boldness, but on that night, they were still learning who he truly was. And in their awe, they asked one another, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." It was not just a question, it was a revelation. Before their eyes, the man they followed was revealed as more than a teacher, more than a healer. He was Lord over creation itself. As you reflect on the calming of the storm, imagine yourself in that boat. The winds howling, the waves crashing, fear rising within you. And then, imagine Jesus standing, his voice cutting through the chaos, "Peace. Be still." Let those words wash over you now. Whatever storm you may be facing, external or internal, seen or unseen, know that he is with you. He does not always remove the storm immediately, but he gives peace in the midst of it. Rest in this truth tonight. The one who commands the seas commands your life as well. Trust him. Lean on him. Let his peace guard your heart. And now, as the sea lies calm under the night sky, we move to yet another wondrous moment, one where Jesus would not only command the waters, but walk upon them. Walking on water. The day had ended with a miracle. On a grassy hillside by the Sea of Galilee, thousands had been fed with only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. The crowd had eaten until they were full, and still, 12 baskets of food remained. It had been a day of wonder, a day when the people had seen the hand of God provide through Jesus. But as the evening drew near, Jesus dismissed the multitude. He urged his disciples to get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, while he himself stayed behind. With gentle firmness, he sent them away, for he longed to be alone. The boat pushed out from the shore, its sail catching the cool evening breeze, and the disciples began their journey across the darkening waters. Meanwhile, Jesus went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. The quiet of the high place wrapped around him. The sky deepened into night, the stars beginning to appear, one by one, above the hills. The lake below shimmered faintly under the moonlight, and the voices of the departing crowds faded into silence. There, alone with his Father, Jesus prayed. As the hours passed, the night grew darker. The boat carrying the disciples had traveled far from land. The waters beneath them shifted restlessly. The wind had begun to rise, stronger and stronger, until the boat was buffeted by the waves. The sails strained, the wood groaned, and the men worked together, struggling to keep their course. Midnight came, and still the storm winds blew. The disciples rowed against the gusts, their faces weary, their bodies aching. The sea tossed them relentlessly. The moon slid behind a veil of clouds, and the night felt heavy and uncertain. Then, in the fourth watch of the night, the darkest hours just before dawn, something appeared upon the waters. At first, it was only a faint shape, moving across the waves. The disciples strained their eyes through the shadows. The storm winds howled, the waters churned, yet there was a figure walking steadily upon the surface of the sea. Step by step, calm and unhurried, he moved toward them. Terror filled their hearts. They cried out in fear, saying, "It is a ghost!" Their voices rose above the storm, trembling with panic. But immediately, the figure spoke. His voice was steady, carrying across the wind and the waves. "Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid." The disciples heard, and in that voice, they knew him. It was Jesus, their master, walking upon the sea. Peter, bold and uncertain all at once, called back to him, "Lord, if it is truly you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus answered simply, "Come." Peter stepped from the boat. His feet touched the waves, and for a moment, they held him. He walked upon the water, his eyes fixed on Jesus, each step carrying him closer. The wind still roared, the sea still churned, yet he walked, lifted by faith and wonder. But then his gaze faltered. He looked at the wind, at the waves rising around him, and fear gripped his heart. In that instant, he began to sink. The waters pulled at him, cold and heavy. "Lord, save me," he cried. At once, Jesus reached out his hand. Strong and sure, he caught Peter and lifted him up. Together they stood upon the water, the storm raging around them. "Why did you doubt?" Jesus said softly. And when they climbed into the boat, the wind ceased. The sea grew calm once more, smooth and still beneath the fading night sky. The disciples sat in awe, their eyes wide, their hearts trembling with wonder. They looked at him, at the one who had walked upon the water, who had stilled the storm, who had reached out and saved. And in the quiet that followed, they worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." The boat drifted gently upon the calm waters. The first light of dawn touched the horizon, painting the sky with shades of pale gold and rose. The storm was gone, and the night had passed. And there, upon the sea, the disciples had seen the glory of their Lord. Feeding the 5,000. The news had reached Jesus. John the Baptist, the forerunner, the prophet who had prepared the way, had been taken from this life. When he heard, Jesus withdrew. His heart was heavy, and he longed for solitude. Stepping into a boat, he crossed the waters to a quiet place, seeking rest and prayer away from the press of the crowds. But the people had seen him leave. They had watched the boat drift across the lake, and word spread quickly from town to town, village to village. Men and women, young and old, hurried after him. They traveled on foot along the shore, through the fields and dusty paths, until great multitudes had gathered, all longing to be near him. When Jesus stepped ashore, he saw them waiting. The crowd stretched far and wide, thousands upon thousands, their faces turned toward him with expectation. They were weary, some sick, some broken, some searching for hope. And though he had sought rest, his heart was moved with compassion. He welcomed them. He healed their sick. He spoke words of life. All day, as the sun arched high above and began to fall toward evening, he gave himself to them. The hours passed. The shadows lengthened. Hunger began to stir among the people, for they had followed him far from their homes, and there was no food in that desolate place. The disciples came to him with concern. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it is already late. Send the crowds away, so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." But Jesus answered them, calm and sure, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." The disciples looked at one another, uncertain, confused. They counted what they had and brought it to him. "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they said. So little, against so many. Jesus did not turn them away. He said, "Bring them here to me." The people were told to sit down on the grass. Thousands of men, women, and children settled across the hillside, the evening light soft upon them, the sea glimmering in the distance. The air was still, as though waiting for what was to come. Jesus took the loaves and the fish into his hands. He lifted his eyes toward heaven. He gave thanks. Then he broke the loaves, piece by piece, and handed them to the disciples. The disciples carried the food into the crowd. They gave bread to the people, and there was enough. They gave fish to the people, and there was more. The loaves did not end. The fish did not run out. Basket after basket was filled, and still they continued. The people ate. They ate until they were satisfied, until hunger was gone, until strength returned to their bodies. Fathers broke bread for their children. Mothers shared fish with their little ones. Neighbors passed food to one another. And still the baskets were not empty. When all had eaten their fill, the disciples gathered the pieces that remained. 12 baskets full of fragments, more than they had at the beginning. Those who were fed that day were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The multitude, once weary and hungry, was filled and content, the air alive with quiet wonder. The evening deepened into twilight. The last of the bread was shared, the final fragments gathered. Across the hillside, the people rested, their faces calm, their hearts touched by what they had seen and received. The sea lay still at the edge of the shore. The sky above shifted into shades of rose and violet as the sun slipped below the horizon. And there, in that lonely place, thousands had been fed with 5 loaves and 2 fish, placed in the hands of Jesus. Healing the official's son. Jesus had returned once more to Cana in Galilee, the town where he had turned water into wine. The memory of that first sign still lingered there, a quiet wonder remembered by those who had seen it. The hills stretched green and rolling around the village, the paths dusty beneath the summer sun, the wells and courtyards alive with the sound of daily life. News of his return spread quickly. The people murmured his name, for many had heard of the works he had done in Jerusalem, the signs and wonders during the feast. And now he was here again, in Cana, the small town that had first seen his glory revealed. Far away, in Capernaum, a boy lay sick. His father, an official in the service of the king, watched helplessly as his child grew weaker. The fever burned within the boy, and the days dragged on with no relief. Physicians had no cure. Hope seemed to fade with each passing hour. But then, word came, Jesus of Nazareth had returned to Galilee. The father's heart stirred with urgency. He had heard of the miracles, of the water made wine, of healings and signs. Perhaps, if he could reach him, his son might live. The journey from Capernaum to Cana was long, nearly a day's walk, but the father did not hesitate. He set out quickly, his steps driven by love and desperation. The road wound over hills and valleys, the sun climbing high above him, his thoughts fixed only on his boy. At last, breathless and weary, he arrived in Cana. There, among the people, he found Jesus. He came to him and begged, his voice heavy with grief and urgency. "Sir," he said, "come down before my child dies." The crowd listened. The man's plea was desperate, his heart laid bare before the healer. Jesus looked at him, his eyes steady, his voice calm. "Unless you people see signs and wonders, you will never believe," he said. But the father did not turn away. He pleaded again, his words trembling. "Sir, please, come down before my child dies." And Jesus spoke. His words were simple, yet filled with authority. "Go. Your son lives." The man stood in silence. No sign was given, no journey made together. Only the words remained, "Your son lives." Something stirred in the father's heart. He believed the word Jesus had spoken to him. He turned from Cana and began the long road home, carrying nothing but the promise he had received. The sun sank lower as he walked, the sky fading into evening. Step by step, he retraced the path toward Capernaum, his mind turning again and again to the words, "Your son lives." Before he reached the house, while he was still on the way, his servants came running to meet him. Their faces were bright with joy, their voices eager with news. "Your son lives," they cried. The father stopped, his heart racing. He asked them, "At what time did he begin to get better?" And they answered, "Yesterday, at the 7th hour, the fever left him." The man's breath caught. He remembered the moment, the very hour when Jesus had spoken in Cana, "Your son lives." He knew then, beyond all doubt, that the word had been true. His son was healed, not by medicine, not by chance, but by the power of the one he had sought. When he returned home, he embraced his child, alive and well, strength restored to him. Joy filled the house, and awe filled their hearts. From that day, he and his whole household believed. The evening deepened, and peace settled over the home. The boy slept soundly, his fever gone, his breath steady and calm. And the father remembered the voice he had heard on the road in Cana, the words that carried life across distance and time, "Go. Your son lives." The miraculous catch of fish. The morning light spread softly across the waters of the Sea of Galilee. Gentle waves lapped against the shore, and the sound of voices rose from the crowd that pressed in, eager to hear the words of Jesus. He stood by the water's edge, the multitude surrounding him, each person leaning closer, straining to catch every word. The sea shimmered in the sunlight, and along the shore, 2 boats rested. The fishermen were nearby, weary from their long night. Their nets lay empty, stretched across the sand as they cleaned and mended them. Jesus stepped into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon. He asked him to push out a little from the land. Simon obeyed, and Jesus sat down in the boat, teaching the people as the water carried his voice gently across to the crowd. When he had finished speaking, he turned to Simon and said, "Put out into the deep water, and let down your nets for a catch." Simon hesitated. His hands were rough, his face tired. "Master," he said, "we have worked hard all night and caught nothing. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." They rowed out into deeper waters. Simon and his companions lowered the nets once more. And then, the water stirred. The nets pulled heavy, straining against their hands. Fish, more fish than they could count, filled the nets until they began to break. They signaled to their partners in the other boat, and together they hauled in the catch. The boats grew so full that they began to sink under the weight of it, or fell upon them. Simon Peter, overwhelmed, fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." But Jesus looked at him with calm assurance. "Do not be afraid," he said. "From now on, you will fish for people." And when they brought their boats to land, they left everything, nets, fish, boats, and followed him. Time passed. Jesus walked with them through Galilee, taught in synagogues, healed the sick, raised the dead. He was arrested, crucified, and buried. Yet on the third day, he rose again. And after his resurrection, once more, the sea would witness a miracle. The disciples were again by the Sea of Galilee, though now it was called the Sea of Tiberias. 7 of them were together: Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, James, and John, and 2 others. Peter spoke, his voice heavy with restlessness, "I am going fishing." They went out with him, taking a boat onto the dark waters. All night they cast their nets, lowering and raising, pulling and straining. But the sea gave them nothing. Hour after hour passed. The stars moved slowly across the sky. The net remained empty. As dawn broke, faint light spread across the horizon. On the shore stood a figure, though they did not know it was Jesus. He called to them, his voice carrying over the quiet waters. "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said to them, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." They obeyed, and when they did, the net filled instantly with fish. So many that they could not haul it in. The water churned with life, the net stretched tight with the weight of the catch. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." At once, Simon Peter wrapped his garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. He swam quickly to shore, while the others followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there, with fish laid upon it, and bread beside it. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." Peter climbed aboard and dragged the net to shore. It was full of large fish, 153, yet the net was not torn. Jesus said, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. There, on the shore, in the quiet of the morning, the risen Lord shared a simple meal with his friends. The smell of fire and bread, the sound of waves upon the shore, the warmth of dawn upon the water, all bore witness to the one who had called them first from their boats, and who now called them still. Healing Peter's mother-in-law. The day had been full. Jesus had been teaching in the synagogue at Capernaum. His words had carried an authority unlike any they had ever heard. People had marveled at him, their hearts stirred, their minds awakened. And then, in that very synagogue, he had rebuked an unclean spirit and set a man free. As the crowd lingered, whispers of awe spread through the town. Some followed him as he left, eager to see more, to hear more, to remain near him. When Jesus, James, John, and Simon Peter stepped from the synagogue, they turned toward Peter's home. The narrow streets of Capernaum wound between stone houses, the lake shimmering in the distance, the air alive with the scent of the sea and cooking fires. But within the house, there was illness. Peter's mother-in-law lay in bed, her body weakened by fever. The room was hushed, the air heavy with worry. Those in the house moved quietly, their voices low, their faces tense with concern. As soon as Jesus entered, they told him about her. There was no hesitation, no long explanations. They simply spoke the truth: she was sick, and she needed him. Jesus walked to where she lay. The room was dim, the outlines of simple furnishings casting soft shadows along the walls. He came close to her bedside and leaned down. Gently, he took her hand. His touch was steady, sure, filled with quiet compassion. Then he lifted her up. At once, the fever left her. Strength returned to her body as swiftly as the weakness had come. Her eyes opened fully, and she rose from her bed. No longer weak, she began to serve them. She moved about the house with renewed energy, preparing food, offering care, the warmth of hospitality flowing from her as naturally as breath. Her healing was complete, not only in body but in spirit, a place in the life of the household restored. In the stillness that followed, the disciples looked on, their hearts filled with wonder. They had seen power in the synagogue, and now they had seen it in a simple home, in a moment of quiet need. The fever had fled. The house was alive again with movement, with gratitude, with the presence of the one who carried healing in his very touch. Feeding the 4,000. The days had stretched long, filled with the sound of Jesus' voice as he taught the people who had gathered around him. They had followed him into the hills, far from their towns and villages, drawn by his words, by his compassion, by the hope that seemed to rest in every step he took. For 3 days they stayed with him. The sun rose and set, and still they remained, listening, watching, bringing their sick, their weary, their broken, and laying them before him. And he healed them. The lame walked. The blind opened their eyes to see the light of day. The mute found their voices, and the crippled were made whole. The crowd marveled, and they glorified the God of Israel. But the days of waiting, of listening, of healing, had left them weary. They had brought little with them into the wilderness, and what they had carried was gone. Now they sat upon the ground, weak with hunger, the children leaning against their mothers, the men silent, their faces lined with the strain of empty stomachs. Jesus looked upon them. His eyes rested on the crowd, on their tired faces, on their need. And he called his disciples to him. "I have compassion for these people," he said. "They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way." The disciples looked at one another, then back at him. Around them stretched the open countryside, barren and empty. "Where could we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd?" they asked. "How many loaves do you have?" Jesus said. 7, they replied, "and a few small fish." He told the crowd to sit down upon the ground. The people lowered themselves, gathering in groups, the murmur of voices falling into a hush as they waited. The disciples moved among them, steadying the children, guiding the elderly, helping them settle upon the earth. Jesus took the 7 loaves and the fish into his hands. He looked up toward heaven. The morning light fell gently across his face as he gave thanks. Then he broke the bread, piece by piece, and handed it to the disciples. They, in turn, gave it to the people. The bread passed from hand to hand. The fish followed. And as it did not end. The baskets returned full again and again. The people ate, the children first, then the women and men, each one taking and eating until their hunger was satisfied. The air filled with the quiet sounds of eating, of gratitude, of relief. Mothers smiled as their children's eyes grew bright again. Fathers leaned back, strength returning to their bodies. The crowd was filled, not with a little, but with abundance. When they had all eaten their fill, the disciples moved among them once more, gathering what remained. 7 baskets were filled with leftovers, more than they had begun with, more than they could have imagined. Those who ate were about 4,000 men, besides women and children. And when the meal was done, when the people had been satisfied, Jesus dismissed the crowd. Slowly, they rose, their voices filled with thanksgiving, their hearts strengthened, their bodies renewed. Jesus and his disciples stepped into the boat, the gentle waters waiting to carry them to the region of Magadan. The shore grew quiet again, but the memory of that day lingered, a day when compassion turned scarcity into abundance, when hunger was met with bread, and when the hands of the people touched the miracle of heaven made present before them. Coin in the fish's mouth. The journey had taken Jesus and his disciples north, into Galilee, to the lakeside town of Capernaum. The streets were narrow, the stone houses close together, the air filled with the scent of the sea and the sounds of daily life. Fishermen mended their nets along the shore, children laughed in the courtyards, and traders moved through the marketplace with their goods. As they entered the town, men approached Peter. They were the collectors of the temple tax, the offering given each year for the service of the house of God. Their voices were polite, yet insistent. "Does your teacher not pay the temple tax?" they asked. Peter, without hesitation, replied, "Yes, he does." The collectors nodded and moved on, satisfied. But Peter, thoughtful, turned back toward the house where Jesus was staying. He stepped inside, the sounds of the street fading behind him. Before Peter could speak, Jesus looked at him. His eyes were calm, yet searching, as though he already knew the question that lay upon Peter's heart. "What do you think, Simon?" Jesus asked. "From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes, from their own children, or from others?" Peter considered, then answered, "From others." "Then the children are exempt," Jesus said gently. His words carried a quiet depth, pointing beyond the moment to a greater truth. Yet he added, "But so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake. Throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch. Open its mouth, and you will find a coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours." Peter listened, his heart steadying as he received the instruction. He left the house and walked toward the lake. The waters of Galilee shimmered beneath the sun, their surface rippling with the breeze. He picked up his line, cast it into the water, and waited. The waves lapped gently at the shore. The air was filled with the calls of seabirds, the creak of boats drifting in the harbor, the voices of fishermen calling to one another. Then, suddenly, the line tugged. Peter pulled it in, and there, writhing in his hands, was a fish, its scales glinting in the light. He reached to open its mouth, and within it lay a small coin, the exact amount needed for the temple tax. He held it in his hand, marveling at the sight. Just as the master had said, so it was. No more, no less. Peter carried the coin back, a quiet smile touching his face. The miracle was not one of grandeur, not one witnessed by thousands, but one hidden in the rhythm of daily life, woven into the simplicity of obedience. With that single coin, Jesus and Peter would pay the tax. The matter was settled, the offense avoided, the lesson gently left to linger in the heart. And so the day moved on, the sun lowering toward the horizon, the waters of Galilee stretching wide and calm, holding within them yet another story of the one who walked among them, whose presence touched even the smallest details of life. Healing a paralyzed man. The news spread quickly. Word had traveled through the narrow streets and winding alleys of Capernaum that Jesus had returned. Soon, the town was alive with murmurs, voices carrying from door to door, "He is here, the teacher is back. He has come home." And so they came. From every part of the town, from nearby villages and countryside paths, people made their way to the house where he was staying. Men and women, the old and the young, the sick and the curious, they all gathered, drawn by hope and by the memory of what he had already done among them. The house filled quickly. The doorway was crowded, the windows pressed with faces, and the courtyard outside overflowed with those who could not get in. The air was heavy with expectation, with the shuffle of feet, with the hush of voices as they strained to hear his words. Inside, Jesus spoke to them, teaching about the kingdom of God, his voice steady, his presence commanding yet gentle, as though each word was a seed planted into the hearts of those who listened. Among the crowd, at a distance, for men struggled to carry a burden. Their friend, a man paralyzed and unable to walk, lay upon a mat. For years he had depended upon others to carry him where he needed to go. His limbs were weak, his body bound by stillness. Yet his friends had not given up hope. They believed that if they could only place him before Jesus, something would change. But as they reached the house, their hope was tested. The crowd was too thick, the doorway blocked, the way inside impossible. They paused, their eyes searching for a way. To turn back seemed unthinkable. To wait seemed unbearable. And so they looked upward, toward the roof. In those days, the roofs were flat, built of wooden beams covered with branches and packed with layers of clay and straw. The men exchanged glances, determination in their faces. Together, they climbed the outside steps, carrying the mat with care, each movement deliberate, their friend steady in their hands. When they reached the top, they set him down gently and began to work. They pulled away the hardened clay, piece by piece, their hands digging, their breath quick with effort. Dust fell into the room below, where people shifted and murmured, looking upward as the light began to break through. Then, carefully, they widened the opening until it was large enough. They tied ropes to the corners of the mat and lowered their friend down. Slowly, gently, the mat descended, through the hole in the roof, down into the very center of the room, before Jesus himself. The crowd fell silent, their eyes wide, their breath caught. The man lay there, still and broken, before the teacher. Jesus looked up. He saw the faces of the 4 men peering down through the roof, their eyes filled with faith and love. He looked at the man before him, helpless upon the mat, and in the quiet he said words that no one expected. "Son, your sins are forgiven." A murmur spread through the room. Some of the teachers of the law, sitting nearby, began to whisper among themselves. "Why does this man talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Jesus knew their thoughts. He turned toward them and asked, "Why are you thinking these things? Which is easier, to say to this paralyzed man, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up, take your mat and walk'? But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." He turned back to the man. The room was utterly still. Every eye was fixed upon him. Then, with a voice steady and commanding, he said, "I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home." The man stirred. Slowly, strength began to flow into his limbs. His legs, once lifeless, moved beneath him. He placed his hands upon the mat, pressed against it, and lifted himself. The crowd gasped, their hearts pounding. With trembling steps, he stood. His feet bore his weight. His body, once paralyzed, was now alive with power. He bent, picked up the mat that had carried him for so long, and turned toward the door. The crowd parted, their eyes wide, their voices hushed in awe. Step by step, he walked out before them all, his mat under his arm, his head lifted, his heart alive. The house erupted with wonder. Voices rose in astonishment, praises filling the air. "We have never seen anything like this," they cried. And outside, beneath the open sky, the man walked freely, each step a miracle, each breath a gift, his life forever changed. Driving out an evil spirit in Capernaum. It was the Sabbath day in Capernaum. The streets of the town were quiet, the shops closed, the fishermen's boats resting by the shore. Families moved slowly toward the synagogue, gathering together for worship. The air was calm, the morning sunlight spilling softly across the stone buildings. Inside the synagogue, the people assembled, sitting shoulder to shoulder along the benches and floor. The walls were plain, the room filled with the sound of voices speaking in low tones, the rustle of garments as men and women settled into place. Then Jesus entered. His presence was simple, without ceremony, yet when he began to teach, the atmosphere shifted. He spoke with clarity, his words steady, his tone gentle yet filled with authority. Unlike the teachers of the law, who quoted endlessly from others, Jesus spoke as one who carried truth within himself. The people listened, their hearts stirred, their eyes fixed upon him. Murmurs spread quietly through the crowd. "Who is this? What kind of teaching is this?" But then, from among them, a sudden voice rose. Sharp, loud, filled with torment. A man stood, his body tense, his face strained. An unclean spirit had taken hold of him, and its presence poured out in words that shattered the quiet. "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth?" the spirit cried out. "Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." The crowd fell silent. Fear rippled through them. They turned their eyes to Jesus, waiting, wondering what he would do. Jesus looked at the man, his face calm, his presence steady as a rock amid the storm. His voice, firm yet unshaken, cut through the chaos. "Be quiet," he said. "Come out of him." At once the man's body convulsed. A cry rang out, harsh and desperate, echoing through the synagogue. Then, just as suddenly, it was over. the spirit left him, and the man fell still. His breathing steadied. His face softened. Peace, long absent, returned to him. The crowd gasped, their eyes wide in amazement. Whispers rose, voices filled with awe. What is this? A new teaching, and with authority. He even gives orders to evil spirits, and they obey him. And news of him began to spread. From that synagogue in Capernaum, word carried into the streets, into the countryside, from one household to the next. The name of Jesus was spoken with wonder, his authority recognized, his power undeniable. And so, on that Sabbath morning, in a simple synagogue by the sea, the people had seen something they would never forget. Healing the man with a withered hand. It was another Sabbath day, and once more Jesus entered the synagogue. The room was familiar, the stone walls, the narrow windows, the low hum of voices before the service began. People gathered as they always did, but on this day, there was a tension in the air. Among those seated were some of the Pharisees, their eyes watchful, their faces unreadable. They had come not only to hear but to observe. Their thoughts were heavy with suspicion, waiting for a reason to accuse him. In the midst of the gathering was a man whose hand was withered. His fingers curled and lifeless, his palm drawn in upon itself, the strength long gone. He sat quietly, not expecting much, his presence almost hidden among the crowd. But Jesus saw him. His eyes rested on the man, not with judgment or curiosity, but with compassion. Slowly, deliberately, he said, "Stand up in front of everyone." The man rose, hesitant at first, then obedient, and stepped forward. The crowd shifted, their attention now fixed upon him. Whispers stirred, all eyes glancing from the man to Jesus, and then to the Pharisees who sat in silence. Jesus turned to them and spoke, his voice steady and clear. "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" The question hung in the air. No answer came. The room grew still. The Pharisees remained silent, their lips closed, their hearts hard. Jesus looked around at them, his eye searching each face. A shadow of grief passed over him, a sorrow for their hardness, their refusal to see. Yet his resolve did not waver. Turning back to the man, he said gently, "Stretch out your hand." The man lifted his arm. Slowly, carefully, he extended it. And before the eyes of all, the withered hand came alive. The fingers straightened, the palm opened, the strength returned. It was whole, as sound as the other. Healing the centurion's servant. The town of Capernaum rested by the waters of the Galilee. Fishermen's boats swayed gently on the waves, and narrow streets wound between stone houses. It was here that Jesus entered once again, the people gathering quickly to see him, as word of his works had already spread through the region. Among those who came to him was a Roman centurion, a man of authority, dressed not as the townspeople but in the garments of a soldier. His presence was unusual in the midst of the crowd, yet his manner was not proud. Instead, he approached with humility, carrying in his voice a weight of concern. "Lord," he said, bowing before Jesus, "my servant lies at home, paralyzed, suffering terribly." The words were simple, but his tone revealed his burden. Though he commanded many, though men answered to his word, there was nothing he could do for the one he cared for. Jesus listened, his face calm, his presence steady. With compassion, he answered, "I will come and heal him." The centurion lifted his eyes, astonishment mingling with reverence. He shook his head gently, speaking with deep respect. "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. But only say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, 'Go,' and he goes. I tell another, 'Come,' and he comes. I say to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." His voice was steady, his conviction clear. He understood authority, the power of a word spoken with command. And in Jesus, he recognized a far greater authority, one that did not need distance crossed or hands laid, but only a word to bring life where there was suffering. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed. He turned to those who followed him, the disciples and the people gathered close. "Truly I tell you," he said, "I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west, and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside, into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Then he turned back to the centurion, his voice warm, steady, and full of assurance. "Go. Let it be done just as you believed it would." And in that very hour, far away in the centurion's home, the servant's suffering ended. Strength returned to his body, and peace filled the room. The centurion went his way, carrying with him not only relief for his servant, but also the deep assurance that faith in Jesus had brought healing without a touch, without a journey, but by the power of his word alone. Healing the woman with the issue of blood. The streets were crowded that day. The sound of voices rose and fell, sandals pressing against the dust, children calling to one another. At the center of the gathering was Jesus, moving slowly through the throng, his disciples close by, the people pressing in on every side. Among the crowd was a woman, quiet and unnoticed by most. For 12 long years, she had suffered with a flow of blood. She had gone to many physicians, seeking help, offering all that she had, yet no remedy was found. Her strength had faded, her resources gone, and still her suffering remained. But she had heard of Jesus. Whispers of his power, stories of his touch, accounts of the sick made well and the broken made whole. These words had reached her ears, stirring a hope that had long been silent. She did not call out to him. She did not step boldly into his path. Instead, she moved quietly through the crowd, her heart trembling, her steps uncertain. She thought within herself, "If I can only touch his cloak, I will be healed." The people pressed around him tightly, but she drew near, slipping through the gathering. At last, she reached out her hand. Her fingers brushed the edge of his garment. Just a touch, and nothing more. And in that instant, something changed within her body. The bleeding stopped. The weariness lifted. Strength returned like a quiet stream flowing back into dry ground. She knew it with certainty. After 12 years of suffering, she was healed. Jesus paused. The crowd still pressed close, yet he stopped in his steps. He turned and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" The disciples looked at him in surprise. "You see the people crowding against you," they said, "and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking, his eyes moving over the crowd, searching, steady. He knew power had gone out from him. The woman felt the weight of his gaze. Trembling, she stepped forward, falling at his feet. With a voice that quivered, she told him the whole truth, her suffering, her hope, her touch, her healing. Jesus listened, his face gentle, his presence calm. Then he spoke words that lifted her heart. "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." The crowd fell silent, watching her rise. No longer hidden, no longer broken, she walked away whole. And the noise of the crowd returned, the footsteps moving forward once more, but for the woman, everything had changed. With one quiet touch, she was restored, delivering the Gerasene demoniac. The night had given way to morning as Jesus and his disciples stepped out of the boat. The waves lapped softly against the shore of the region of the Gerasenes. The land was quiet, the hills rising gently, caves and rocky tombs scattered along the slopes. The air was still, though there lingered a heaviness, a silence broken not by songbirds but by something deeper and unsettled. From the tombs came a man. His appearance was wild, his hair unkempt, his body marked with wounds from stones he had struck against himself. For a long time, he had lived among the graves, far from home, far from peace. No one could restrain him. Chains had been placed on his hands and feet, but he tore them apart. Shackles were broken, iron could not hold him. Day and night, among the tombs and on the hills, his cries carried out into the air. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran down from the rocky places, falling before him. With a loud voice, he cried out, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Swear to God that you will not torment me." For already Jesus had spoken to him, saying, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." The man's body trembled, his voice breaking with anguish. Jesus asked him gently, "What is your name?" The reply came not in calmness, but in a cry, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And the voices within begged him earnestly not to send them away from that place. Nearby, on the hillside, a large herd of pigs was feeding. The spirits pleaded, "Send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them." Jesus gave them permission. In a moment, the man convulsed, and then he grew still, his body loosening as if a great weight had been lifted. The unclean spirits left him, rushing into the herd of pigs. The animals stirred, panicked, and suddenly they ran. Down the steep bank they went, all 2,000 of them, rushing into the waters below, where they were drowned. The herdsmen who had been watching fled. They ran into the town, into the countryside, spreading the news of what they had seen. People began to come, drawn by the story, to see for themselves. When they arrived, they found the man who had been possessed. He was sitting there quietly, dressed, and in his right mind. The one they had feared, the one who had lived among tombs and chains, now sat calmly at the feet of Jesus. And the people were afraid. Those who had seen it told the others what had happened, of the man delivered, and of the herd of pigs. And the people, troubled and fearful, began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. As Jesus prepared to step back into the boat, the man who had been delivered came to him. His voice was steady now, his eyes clear. He begged to go with him, to remain by his side. But Jesus did not permit him. Instead, he said gently, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you." The man obeyed. He went throughout the region of the Decapolis, telling all that Jesus had done. And the people marveled. The waves touched the shore once more. The boat rocked gently as Jesus stepped inside with his disciples. Behind them, on the hills and among the towns, word of mercy and freedom began to spread, carried by the voice of the one who had been restored. Healing the deaf and mute. The journey carried Jesus northward, away from the familiar shores of Galilee. He passed through the region of Tyre, then moved along the way of Sidon, and finally returned toward the Sea of Galilee, entering the land of the Decapolis. The countryside was quiet, dotted with villages, olive trees swaying gently, the air filled with the scent of the season. Word had spread once more that he was near. And as before, the people began to gather. Among them was a man who could not hear, and whose tongue stumbled when he tried to speak. His friends, moved with compassion, brought him to Jesus. They did not ask loudly, nor did they demand. Instead, they pleaded gently, begging him to lay his hand upon their companion. Jesus looked upon the man with kindness. He saw not only the silence that bound his ears, but the struggle of speech that weighed heavily on his life. And so, instead of leaving him in the press of the crowd, he took him aside, away from the noise and the eyes of others. There, in the quiet, Jesus reached out his hands. He placed his fingers into the man's ears. Then, with tenderness, he touched the man's tongue. Lifting his eyes toward heaven, Jesus sighed, and spoke a single word, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. At once, something shifted within the man. His ears were opened. The silence that had held him for so long fell away, replaced by the sound of wind stirring the trees, the footsteps on the earth, the murmur of voices. His tongue was loosened, and for the first time, words formed clearly upon his lips. He could speak. He could hear. Jesus instructed those present not to spread the word. But the wonder was too great, the joy too overwhelming. The people marveled, their voices rising as they declared, "He has done everything well." He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. And the man who once lived in silence now joined in the sounds of life, hearing, speaking, free at last. The hills of the Decapolis stood quietly around them, but within the hearts of the people, awe and gratitude stirred, echoing long after the moment had passed. Healing a demon-possessed mute man. The sun was high, pouring its light over the villages of Galilee. The streets were filled with footsteps, voices mingling as people went about their daily work. Word of Jesus had spread from town to town, and wherever he walked, crowds gathered, hungry for hope, thirsty for healing. On this day, as he was leaving the company of others he had just helped, some men came forward, leading with them a figure who could not speak. His eyes were restless, his movements unsettled. It was not only silence that held him, but a spirit that bound him, leaving him unable to find his own voice. The men brought him before Jesus. No words were exchanged from the one in need. He could not plead, could not utter even a whisper of his own condition. But the heaviness of his silence spoke enough. Those around watched, waiting, their hearts caught between hope and wonder. Jesus looked upon the man, his gaze steady and full of compassion. No ritual was needed, no long display. With his presence alone, he commanded the unclean spirit to depart. And in that moment, the man's body stilled. His eyes, once clouded, grew clear. His lips moved, and for the first time, sound came forth. Words began to form, halting at first, then flowing freely. His voice, long held captive, now filled the air. The crowd marveled, their astonishment spreading like ripples in water. They whispered to one another, "Nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel." But not all were moved in the same way. Among the Pharisees, voices rose with suspicion. They murmured, saying, "It is by the prince of demons that he drives out demons." Yet the people could not deny what they had witnessed. A man once silent now spoke. A life once bound was set free. The hush of all lingered in the streets, as those who had seen it carried the story onward, telling and retelling the moment when silence was broken, and freedom was restored. The day stretched on, the sun casting its warmth across the land. But for the man who had been mute, every sound was new, every word a gift, every moment a song of release. Healing the lepers. The journey toward Jerusalem continued. The road stretched through valleys and hills, winding along the borderlands between Samaria and Galilee. It was a quiet path, carrying with it the dust of many travelers, the sound of sandals pressing against the earth, the breeze moving softly through olive groves. Along this way, a small group lingered at a distance. 10 men, marked not by their clothing alone, but by the burden they carried upon their skin. They were lepers, outcasts of their own villages, set apart from their families, forced to live in shadows and silence on the edges of towns. Their voices, though weak, rose in unison as Jesus drew near. They did not come close, for the law forbade it. Instead, from afar, they cried out, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." Jesus stopped. His eyes turned toward them, seeing not only their illness, but their hearts, heavy with longing. He spoke no word of condemnation, offered no lecture on their condition. Instead, he gave them a simple command, "Go, show yourselves to the priests." The words hung in the air, gentle but firm. It was the priests who held the authority to declare someone clean, to restore the banished to their homes, their families, their communities. The men obeyed. They turned, their feet carrying them down the road, perhaps uncertain, perhaps wondering why they had not been touched, why no visible change had yet come. But as they walked, something stirred within them. The sores upon their skin began to fade. The wounds that had long marked their bodies grew whole. Their strength returned. Step by step, they were cleansed. Shouts of joy broke forth as realization swept through them. 9 hurried onward, hearts filled with relief and eagerness to return to life once lost. But one paused. He was a Samaritan, a foreigner among them. And unlike the others, he turned back. With a voice now strong and clear, he praised God aloud, his words filling the air. Falling at Jesus' feet, he gave thanks. Jesus looked upon him with quiet tenderness. Were not 10 cleansed? He asked. Where are the other 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner? Then, with words both gentle and affirming, he said to the man, Rise and go your way. Your faith has made you well. The road lay open before him, the world no longer closed to his touch. His body was whole, but his heart, too, had been restored, filled with gratitude, filled with faith. And the story lingered along that borderland between Samaria and Galilee. 10 were cleansed, but 1 returned, and his voice of thanksgiving still echoes in the quiet paths of Scripture. Healing the crippled woman. It was the Sabbath day, and the synagogue was alive with the hum of voices. The air carried the weight of tradition, the sound of Scripture being read, and the steady rhythm of prayers rising to heaven. The sunlight filtered in, falling across the gathered crowd, where men and women sat in reverent silence. Among them was a woman who had been bound for 18 long years. Her body was bent low, her back curved, unable to straighten. She had grown accustomed to looking down, to seeing only the ground beneath her feet, to walking through life with her eyes fixed on the earth rather than the sky. Day after day, year after year, she carried her burden quietly. She could not stand tall. She could not lift her gaze to meet those around her. Yet, on this day, she had come into the synagogue, just as she had so many times before, seeking the comfort of God's word. And Jesus was there. He was teaching, his voice calm and steady, his presence filling the space with a sense of peace. As his eyes moved over the people, they came to rest on her. He saw not only her bent frame but the years of suffering, the silent endurance, the weight of her affliction. He called her forward. His voice broke through the stillness, Woman, you are set free from your infirmity. The room hushed as he reached out his hands and gently placed them upon her. At once, her body responded. The curve of her back straightened, the weight that held her down was lifted, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, she stood upright. Her eyes, once fixed to the ground, now lifted to the heavens. Her lips opened, and she began to praise God. Joy welled up within her, flowing like a river that had long been dammed. Her voice, clear and strong, filled the synagogue. But not all shared in her joy. The leader of the synagogue, bound by his own rigid view of the Sabbath, objected. He turned to the crowd and said, There are 6 days for work. So come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath. Jesus answered him, his words steady yet filled with authority. You hypocrite! Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from the stall and lead it to give it water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her? The weight of his words fell upon them. Those who opposed him were silenced, shamed by his wisdom. But the people, the ordinary ones who watched with open hearts, rejoiced. They marveled at all the wonderful things he was doing. And the woman, once bent low, once hidden in shadows, now stood tall among them, her face lifted, her spirit free, her voice a song of thanksgiving to the God who had seen her and restored her. Raising Jairus' daughter. The lake was calm that morning, its surface glistening beneath the sun as Jesus returned by boat to the other side. A great crowd had already gathered, waiting, pressing in close to him. Their voices rose and fell, each person eager, each heart carrying its own need. From within the throng came a man of stature and urgency. His name was Jairus, a leader of the synagogue. Though accustomed to dignity and respect, today he was a father first, a father whose heart was breaking. Falling at Jesus' feet, he pleaded earnestly, his voice trembling, My little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be healed and live. Without hesitation, Jesus went with him. The crowd surged forward, surrounding them, eager to witness, eager to follow. Along the way, delays came, other needs, other cries for mercy, but Jairus' request still lingered, heavy in the air. Then, while they were still on the road, messengers arrived from Jairus' house. Their words were heavy, final: "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" The sting of despair must have struck deep, but Jesus, hearing their words, turned at once to Jairus. His voice was calm, steady, unwavering: "Do not fear, only believe." They continued the journey, leaving the crowd behind. Only Peter, James, and John followed with him. At Jairus' house, the sound of mourning filled the air, voices crying out, grief spilling from every corner. The wailing of friends, the sorrow of neighbors, the brokenness of a family filled the home. Jesus entered and said, "Why all this commotion and weeping? The child is not dead but asleep." The mourners laughed bitterly, unable to see beyond their grief. But Jesus sent them all outside. Taking with him only the child's father and mother, and the 3 disciples, he stepped into the quiet of her room. There she lay, the little girl, her body still, her life seemingly gone. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft breaths of those who watched. Jesus approached her, his presence filling the room with calm. He reached out and took her hand, so small within his own. His voice, gentle yet commanding, spoke 2 simple words in her native tongue, "Talitha, little girl, I say to you, arise." At once, her spirit returned. Her eyes opened, her body stirred, and she rose to her feet. Life had come rushing back, and she stood before them, alive. A gasp filled the room, wonder and joy breaking through the sorrow. Her parents looked on, astonished, overwhelmed by what their eyes beheld. Jesus, ever gentle, ever thoughtful, told them simply to give her something to eat. And there, in that quiet house, what was lost had been restored. Death had given way to life. Tears of grief turned to tears of wonder, and the story of Jairus' daughter became a lasting testament to the power of faith and the touch of the Savior. Raising the widow's son at Nain. The road leading into the small town of Nain wound gently through the hills. Jesus and his disciples walked along it, followed by a large crowd that had gathered around him. The air was filled with the murmur of voices, the soft sound of footsteps, and the quiet anticipation of those who had come to see what he would do next. As they neared the town gate, another crowd came into view. It was a funeral procession, moving slowly and solemnly out of the city. The sound of weeping and mourning drifted across the air, heavy with sorrow. At the center of the procession was a woman, a widow, her face lined with grief. She had already lost her husband, and now death had taken her only son, her last companion, her last hope. The coffin was carried before her, the lifeless body of her child wrapped within it. Her steps were heavy, her voice caught in sobs, her heart crushed by loss. For her, the future seemed empty, a life of loneliness stretching before her. The 2 crowds met, one filled with life and expectation, the other weighed down by sorrow and death. At that moment, Jesus looked upon the widow. He saw her pain, her isolation, her brokenness. And his heart was moved with compassion. He stepped forward, his voice calm yet full of care, and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came to the coffin. The bearers stopped, uncertain, as his hand rested gently upon it. The air grew still. All eyes turned to him. With authority that cut through the silence, he spoke, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And in an instant, life returned. The young man sat up and began to speak. His voice, once stilled by death, now rang out with vitality. Murmurs of awe rippled through the crowd as astonishment filled every heart. Jesus, with tender care, helped him down and delivered him back into the arms of his mother. Her tears of sorrow turned to tears of wonder, her grief replaced with overwhelming joy. The people stood in awe. Fear and reverence gripped them, and they began to glorify God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people." News of this miracle spread quickly, flowing through the region of Judea and beyond, carried by every tongue, whispered with wonder, the teacher from Nazareth had spoken, and even death had yielded to his voice. Healing the servant's ear. The night was quiet, the air heavy with the stillness of the olive grove. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus had just risen from prayer. His disciples lingered nearby, weary, their hearts troubled though they could not fully grasp what was unfolding. The peace of the night was suddenly broken. From the distance came the flicker of torches, the glint of weapons, and the sound of footsteps approaching quickly. A crowd emerged, led by soldiers and officials, and among them was Judas, one of the 12, walking with purpose. Judas stepped forward, greeting Jesus with a kiss, a sign of betrayal that pierced the quiet of the garden. The soldiers moved in at once to seize him. The disciples, overwhelmed by fear and confusion, asked, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" In the rush of the moment, one of them acted without waiting for an answer. He drew his sword and struck out wildly. The blade cut through the night, finding its mark on the servant of the high priest. The man cried out in pain as his ear was severed, and chaos rippled through the crowd. The garden, once still, was now filled with shouts, confusion, and the rising tension of violence. But Jesus, calm and steady, broke through the turmoil with his voice. "No more of this," he commanded. His words carried authority, firm yet filled with peace. He stepped forward, reaching out to the injured servant. In the flickering torchlight, his hand touched where the wound had been. And in an instant, the pain was gone, the ear made whole again. The servant's cries fell silent. The crowd, holding their weapons, stood in awe, unsure of what to make of the moment. In the face of betrayal, arrest, and looming suffering, Jesus chose compassion. There, in the midst of fear and hostility, he brought healing. And so, even as he was taken into custody, his final act before the soldiers was not resistance, not anger, but mercy, a quiet touch that restored what had been broken. Healing a boy possessed by an unclean spirit. The mountain behind them was still glowing with the memory of glory. Jesus, along with Peter, James, and John, had just descended from the place of transfiguration, where the disciples had glimpsed his radiance, his divine majesty revealed in dazzling light. Their hearts were still stirred with awe and wonder. But as they came down, the scene before them was far different. At the base of the hill, a large crowd had gathered. The scribes were arguing with the disciples, their voices sharp and pressing. The people looked on, caught between curiosity and concern. When the crowd saw Jesus approaching, they were amazed and ran to greet him. Jesus, calm as always, asked, "What are you arguing with them about?" From within the throng, a man's voice rose, strained, desperate, filled with longing. He stepped forward, his face marked by sorrow and sleepless nights. "Teacher," he said, "I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams at the mouth, grinds his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to cast it out, but they could not." The father's words hung heavy in the air. The boy stood nearby, his body frail from suffering, his eyes distant, trapped in the torment of the spirit. Jesus looked upon them all, then spoke, his voice carrying both sorrow and strength. "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me." And so they brought the boy before him. As soon as the spirit saw Jesus, it convulsed the child. He fell to the ground, rolling and foaming at the mouth. The crowd gasped, but Jesus remained calm. "How long has this been happening to him?" Jesus asked the father. "From childhood," the man replied, his voice trembling. "It has often cast him into fire and into water, to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." The words revealed both hope and doubt. Jesus turned to him, his eyes steady. "If you can? All things are possible for one who believes." And immediately the father cried out, his heart breaking open before all who listened, "I believe, help my unbelief." The crowd pressed closer. The boy lay convulsing, his body racked by the spirit's fury. Seeing the multitude gathering, Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit. His voice rang out with authority. "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." The spirit cried out, shrieking, throwing the boy into terrible convulsions. And then, with a final cry, it left. The boy lay still, so still that many whispered, "He is dead." But Jesus bent down, taking the child's hand. His touch was gentle, firm, and life-giving. He lifted him up, and the boy stood, whole, restored, free. The father looked on, tears welling, relief flooding his soul. His son was safe. Later, when they were alone in a house, the disciples asked him quietly, "Why could we not cast it out?" And Jesus answered them simply, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer." Raising Lazarus. In the quiet village of Bethany, not far from Jerusalem, there lived 3 siblings, Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus. Their home was a place of warmth and welcome, and Jesus himself often stayed with them. They loved him dearly, and he loved them in return. One day, Lazarus grew ill. His condition worsened, and his sisters, deeply concerned, sent word to Jesus. The message was simple yet filled with urgency, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." When Jesus heard this, he did not rush immediately to Bethany. Instead, he spoke words that puzzled his disciples, "This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." And so he remained where he was for 2 more days. Afterward, he said to his disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples hesitated, reminding him that danger awaited there, for the leaders sought to harm him. But Jesus spoke of his purpose and of walking in the light. Then he said plainly, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him." The disciples thought he meant ordinary sleep, but he explained, "Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." And so they set out for Bethany. When they arrived, they learned that Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. The village was filled with mourners who had come to comfort Mary and Martha. Martha, hearing that Jesus was near, went out to meet him while Mary stayed in the house. Her voice trembled as she spoke, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." But Jesus looked at her and said words that have echoed through the ages, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live, and everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" And Martha replied, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." She then went to call her sister Mary. Mary rose quickly and came to him. Those with her followed, thinking she was going to the tomb. When Mary saw Jesus, she fell at his feet, weeping. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died," she said. Jesus saw her tears, and the tears of those with her, and his spirit was deeply moved. He asked, "Where have you laid him?" They replied, "Lord, come and see." And there, before the tomb, Jesus wept. The crowd whispered, "See how he loved him." Then Jesus, still deeply moved, came to the cave. A stone lay across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. Martha hesitated. "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead for days." But Jesus reminded her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Jesus lifted his eyes and prayed, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me." Then, with a loud voice that pierced the silence of death itself, he cried out, "Lazarus, come out!" And from the shadows of the tomb, he came, Lazarus, bound hand and foot with burial cloths, his face wrapped with a cloth. "Unbind him," Jesus said, "and let him go." And so the man who had been dead walked among the living once more. In that moment, grief was turned to astonishment, despair to hope, and death itself was shown to be no match for the voice of the Son of God. The resurrection of Jesus. The sun had set on the darkest of days. Jesus had been crucified, his body laid in a borrowed tomb, and a heavy stone sealed the entrance. Soldiers stood guard, and silence hung over Jerusalem like a heavy veil. For his followers, grief was overwhelming. The one in whom they had placed their hope, the one who had healed the sick, calmed the seas, and raised the dead, now lay lifeless in a tomb. The world itself seemed dimmer, the air heavy with sorrow. But the story was not over. On the first day of the week, just as the sky was still touched with shadows before dawn, several women made their way to the tomb. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. They carried spices, their hearts heavy with love and grief, desiring to honor him in death as they had in life. As they walked, they whispered among themselves, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" The stone was large, far too heavy for them to move. But when they arrived, their eyes widened in wonder. The stone had already been rolled away. They stepped closer, trembling. And when they entered the tomb, they saw that his body was not there. The burial cloths lay in place, but the Lord himself was gone. Suddenly, two men in dazzling garments stood before them, their appearance radiant like lightning. The women bowed down in fear, but the messengers spoke gently. "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you, while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day rise." The women remembered his words. Their hearts began to stir with hope. Quickly, they ran from the tomb, both afraid and filled with great joy, eager to tell the disciples. Mary Magdalene, overwhelmed, lingered outside the tomb, weeping. Through her tears, she bent down once more and looked inside. She saw two angels, one sitting at the head and the other at the feet where Jesus' body had lain. They asked her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She answered, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Turning around, she saw someone standing nearby, but through her tears she did not recognize him. The man asked her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him." Then he spoke her name, Mary. In that single word, her eyes were opened. It was Jesus, alive, standing before her. She cried out, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus gently said, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary ran to the disciples, her voice filled with joy, "I have seen the Lord." Later that same day, as two followers walked on the road to Emmaus, discussing all that had happened, Jesus himself drew near and walked with them. Yet their eyes were kept from recognizing him. He asked them what they were talking about, and they poured out their sorrow. Patiently, he began to open the scriptures to them, explaining how all the law and the prophets pointed to him, how it was written that the Christ must suffer and then enter into his glory. When they reached the village, they urged him to stay with them. At supper, he took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them. In that moment, their eyes were opened, they knew him. And then he vanished from their sight. Their hearts burned within them as they hurried back to Jerusalem to share the news. That evening, the disciples were gathered together behind locked doors, afraid of what might happen to them. Suddenly, Jesus stood among them. His voice was calm and reassuring, "Peace be with you." They were startled, thinking they saw a spirit. But he showed them his hands and his side, the marks of the cross now shining with victory. "Touch me and see," he said. "A spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have." Joy flooded their hearts as they realized the truth. Their Lord, once dead, now stood alive among them. Over the days that followed, he appeared many times, to Mary, to Peter, to the disciples, to Thomas who once doubted, and to many more. He spoke with them, ate with them, and continued to teach them about the kingdom of God. The resurrection was not just an event, it was the dawn of a new creation, the breaking of death's power, and the promise of life everlasting. The stone had been rolled away, and with it, despair gave way to hope, sorrow gave way to joy, and death itself was overcome.